In Matthew 7, Jesus tells a fascinating little story. In verses 3 through 5, he says this. He says, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' and all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the plank out of your own eye, then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." Amazing little story. And to be clear, as we begin, Jesus isn't saying here that we should never correct anyone else. In fact, the scripture calls us to do that, although it's a hard thing to do and even harder to do it well. What Jesus is doing here is reminding us that we should have our own spiritual lives in order before we ever think about going to correct someone else. And I think Jesus is really trying to head off arrogance and self-righteousness from developing in us. And I think that's why he uses such an outlandish image here of this giant plank. I think he wants to highlight how easily we can become arrogant and self-righteous and turn into real hypocrites. At the same time, Jesus is clearly calling us to humility, to have the humility to honestly examine our own lives before God, and to have humility in our disposition if we ever approach anyone about anything. Because the truth is, we have no right to correct others with an attitude of superiority, because we're all sinners. We all need correction. There's also a practical piece here, because the reality is that anyone that we might seek to correct is going to be much more likely to respond positively to a person with a humble disposition whose spiritual house is in order, rather than some arrogant hypocrite. That's just the truth of the matter. But what I really want to focus on is the fact that, as Jesus points out, we often seem to be unaware of our own sin. We often seem to miss the plank or the planks in our own eyes. And it's ironic because we are so good at seeing the sins of others and yet so often blind to our own sin. And I think this is actually one of the things aggravating our society right now. We seem to be more willing than ever to pounce on, to point out, and to offer correction to other people, and yet at the same time, more blind than ever to our own faults and sins. So here's a question for us today. Is it possible that we have not just a speck, but maybe a plank in our own eye? Have we somehow turned a blind eye to one or more ways in which we're not living God's way and doing a disservice to ourselves and the people around us, maybe even causing some hurt? Because Jesus calls us to have the humility, and I think also the courage, to truly ask this question and seek to answer it, and to make any correction in our own lives that we need to do. So let's try to do that. Let's try to remove the planks and the specks from our own eyes and get our own spiritual lives in order. Because if we do that, we will be so much better for it. And then at some point, if we're called on by God to give advice or correction to some other person, we'll be in the right place to do that.